Hi, how's it going? This is President of Collinwood for YouTube. Back here with episode 69, uh, reaction and review. So, this episode, actually, though it starts at Collinwood, we cut right to the Collinsport Hotel Inn, but we don't go to the inn. We're in Burke Devlin's room, and Mrs. Johnson knocks at the door, or someone knocks at the door, and it's Mrs. Johnson. This episode is almost filler. What makes it not, though, is a couple things. One, the obvious recruitment of Mrs. Johnson. To me, she's one of the most willing recruits you'll ever meet to catch Bill Malloy's murder, and you gotta love her for it. um, Clarice Blackburn. Don't get me wrong. I love everybody in this episode. I love Mitch Ryan. I love Nancy Barrett. I love Joel Carruthers. But Clarice Blackburn just takes this episode over because when they're talking, um, when he says when Bill Malloy's body was found at Widow's Hill, uh, Clarice Blackburn's Mrs. Johnson says, "See, he was pointing a finger, trying to find his murder. He was trying to find his murderer," and it's really, really good. Her lines in this are killer amazing. I love them to death. Um, really great. Again, Francis Swan's written dialogue that gets executed here. The writing just went. If you ask me, name the two best written series ever, I would say Dark Shadows and and Star and Star Trek Deep Space Nine. That would be my one and two. Um, I don't know what would be third, but that would definitely be my one and two. Simply because how the writers, you're writing for a gothic soap opera where you have to, yes, you're talking about a murder and who done it, like, look, we as DS fans know who did it, but the writers are keeping, the suspense going, and Roger makes himself even more of a suspect in the previous episode. I talked about that. Roger is not in this episode, but you know who is? Carolyn is in this episode. She was in the last one. She is here to flirt and try to take Joe Haskell away from his job. She is not successful. To me, this is the episode I feel most. And this is the other reason I say it's not filler. To me, this is one of the episodes that begins to mark the end of Carolyn and Joe. This is, I'm not saying it is the end. It marks the end for them. It begins marking the end. Because there was once upon a time, Joe would have just gladly went with Carolyn. And now he say no, if I go to leave, somebody will call for me and look for me, you know. And, he does, look, don't get me wrong, Joe's a hardworking dude. But Carolyn does everything, but, I mean, she kisses him, she makes out with him, and he makes out with her back. She does everything but sleeps with him here to get, and look, she's not going to sleep with him in Roger's office, but the fact that you have Carolyn basically thrown, or not basically, she's throwing herself at Joe, and he doesn't budge. And I love Joel Carruthers' line when uh, Nancy Barrett says, Carolyn says, "I just want to take you to the beach, watch the waves, and forget about Burke Devlin." And I love Joel Carruthers' line here, Joe Haskell saying, "You sure you want to forget about him?" And they play the music. It's a great line, and it just, I think what Joe is really seeing in this episode is Carolyn is looking for, for comfort, but she's also a bit lost too. And he somewhat sees that here, I think. I do think not all the way. There is things he's not seeing. I think she just would rather, was this Joe's opportunity to seal the deal with Carolyn? I would not, and I'm not saying this because of what we know. I'm still not sure to this day if it would have been or not. Even watching this episode back here, I more feel this is marking the beginning. It's marking the beginning of the end of their relationship. Um, I am not saying it's the definitive end. I think Joe is feeling, he doesn't, he gets the sense because here's a guy who's proposed, and has been smacked away how many times. I think he sees, okay, Carolyn likes me. Carolyn doesn't mind being with me, but Carolyn does not love me. She might care for me as a person, sure. And there's a difference between that. And that's something I think Joe is somewhat seeing here, in my opinion. If you guys disagree, please do. I'd love to hear from you. Um, I love the interaction. We do get kissing scenes in this between Joe and Carolyn. Said that. Also, I've said we get the recruitment of Mrs. Johnson. We do. We also get Mrs. Johnson saying that Vicky's seeing Bill's body connects her and Roger. It really doesn't. That's a line that's hard to swallow. It's like, not really. I mean, she wasn't expecting to see a dead body. Nobody was. Her and by the way, she's not the only one who's seen a dead body. Carolyn was with her. um, they were, and by the way, they were looking for Carolyn's watch. They were. I gotta admit, I've never, like, I don't wear watches anymore, but when I did, I can never remember misplacing a watch at, like, a beach or on a hill. I've never done that. But Carolyn did for storyline purposes. And, by the way, Joe Haskell found the watch. So, so you have Mrs. Johnson, who is, I mean, she is more than, after what Burke said to her, well, even in my opinion, before what Burke said to her, she's willing to help Burke catch whoever Bill Malloy's killer is. He tells her that, he tells her the truth that Bill Malloy made a deal with him. If he could help clear his name, would he, cancel his vendetta or stop his vendetta against the Collins family. And Mrs. Johnson goes, yeah, I could see Bill doing that. I could see Bill making it an offer because he wouldn't want anybody to hurt Mrs. Stoddard. He wouldn't want somebody to go after Mrs. Stoddard. So she knows he's telling the truth, and she's, even before that, she was probably willing to help him, and definitely now she is. She's not against it. She has no love for anyone in that family, she says. I love how Burke tells Mrs. Johnson that whoever called at 10:30 was probably the killer, and she probably passed the killer when she left the house at 10, you know, and she goes, I can't believe that. She goes, it's got to be that way. They could have been waiting for him. That is a great deduction. They may have been. We don't know. At this time. Was Matthew Morgan waiting for him? I don't. Matthew Morgan. Poor Matthew. Poor Matt. Again, he says he didn't mean to kill him. He meant to push that body back in the water, though. He meant that. That's just crazy. Crazy. The, good old Matthew. I mean, Matthew, again, to think about what Roger said the last episode and know the fact that Matthew killed Bill Malloy accidentally is crazy. I would not want, I wouldn't hire Matthew as my hitman either. Just say that now. Also, in this episode, because we only get two real locations here, two sets. We get Burke's room and we get Roger's office again. And again, Roger's not here in this office. We know he's out with having a, he's out with Victoria Winter, or he'll be out with Victoria Winters. Um, and Joe says by the time he go to leave, people be calling for him. By the way, he is right. People do call and look for him here, and he can't, he cannot step away. This infuriates Carolyn a lot. It makes her upset with Joe. She goes to Bert. She guess whose room she goes to? Bert Devlin's room. Mrs. Johnson. She knocks on the door and she says who it is. As Burke asks who it is, and he hides Mrs. Johnson and her purse into the kitchen. I love how Carolyn tries to get a drink and he stops her. I'll get you a drink. It's a mess in there. And this is because Mrs. Johnson and Burke could not figure how to get Mrs. Johnson and Collinwood, and this is where you know who's really hurting about Bill, because she mentions Bill Malloy. She goes, who's hurting about Bill Malloy's Mrs. Johnson. She worked for him. She worked for him all her life, and now she doesn't have a job. Could you imagine that? And I love how he does it, and then Carolyn goes, "I got an idea," and she's like, "No." He goes, "What? What's your idea?" Maybe she could come work at Collinwood. Mom's always needed a house. And like Mrs. Johnson's here, she's like, "Oh my God, how quick that escalated." I said Clarissa Blackburn steals this episode in every way. Her facial features steal it all. What an actress. I mean, what a great job. So, by the end of this, Carolyn tells Burke she's going to talk to her mom and see about Mrs. Johnson. He says, okay. And she goes, I'll say it was my idea. And, she doesn't want to say it's Burke's idea. Carolyn leaves, Mrs. Johnson comes out, and I like how Burke apologizes to Mrs. Johnson. I'm sorry for stuffing you in there. And she goes, do you think the girl's involved? She goes, no. But she lives in Collinwood. She's fair game. And everyone at Collinwood is fair game. Even the girls, Mrs. Johnson says, everyone is fair game. And you hear the dramatic music, and that's the end of the episode. I'm sorry these are short. Again, sometimes there's not a lot to talk about within these episodes, but there's enough to talk about, for a video. My favorite scene in this it's Mrs. Johnson's facial feature. But one of my favorite scenes in this is when Burke doesn't really react to Mrs. Johnson's indication that it connects Victoria and Roger, her seeing Bill Malloy's body. That I like, because it's the writers not having Burke lean into something. He says, I don't know. He does say, I don't know about that, but she goes, you like this girl. Yes, there could be no doubt when you're looking. And what Burke does say ultimately is that Vicky must have been mistaken about what she says. He doesn't believe Vicky's deliberately lying. And that's another thing we get with this episode that is key. Burke does believe that Vicky is just honestly mistaken. Pretty soon I'm gonna have a flag in my yard with Vicky's face on it. No, I'm good. But what an episode! I love how great writing by Francis Swan and Leela's direction. It's really, really good. Let's see if there's anything I need to add. No. I've got episode 70 to cover, guys. And then I'm going to do an overall review because there's plenty to talk about from an individual standpoint. I think I'll do the overview, if not later tonight, tomorrow, because I do need to cover episode 70. All right, guys, I hope you have a good day. I'll see you here in a bit.